Welcome everybody. I hope everyone's okay with the trailing through the weather. So it's a big achievement to get here. Just as a little bit of an intro, my name is Jenny Muir. I'm the Chief Counsel for Primary Communication. We're a strategic communication and public affairs company in Australia and a major supporter of Blur Projects and Silent Tears. Have been for about 5 years. Firstly, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. They are the Algonquin Native peoples and the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy. We honour the elders past and present and recognise the valuable contribution of all First Nations women in the advancement of women's rights. So, in Silent Tears, there are stories from First Nations women who can experience double or triple discrimination in their lives. Their stories, along with all the women from across the globe, are in the booklets and that are on your seats or that you have in your hands at the moment. The UN National Committee of Australia and the Silent Tears Project acknowledge that violence against women and girls is a global concern. Often the topics of disability, violence and women are siloed and marginalised. Instead, intersections of identity need to be recognised and responded to. This event provides a focal point for discussion, education and awareness raising, providing the impetus and opportunity to enable further social change for disabled rural women and girls impacted by violence. This event involves experts from Australian and international disability communities who have engaged with the Silent Tears projects over the past 5 years, revealing the violence perpetrated against disabled women and girls globally. The panellists have experience of disability and violence either professionally or personally. This creates a borderless conversation, a necessary one, to identify and discuss courses of action to facilitate change for disabled rural women and girls impacted by violence. The event acknowledges the advancement of the women's agenda and the UN SDG 230 goal of leaving no one behind. So we acknowledge and are very grateful for the partnership and support of the European Disability Forum, Disabled Women's Network of Canada and Oxfam International to this event and to CSW 62, and to the UN Women National Committee of Australia for their sponsorship of this event. Now, topic for today is disability, violence and the survival of rural women globally. That's hard to say. I'd like to now introduce the creator of the Silent Tears project, one of the world's most recognised human rights photographers and artists, Belinda Mason. She's the director of Blur Projects, the creator of Silent Tears as a multimedia silent exhibition and project. Silent Tears provides a voice for women with disability who have been subjected to violence and women who have acquired disability caused by violence. It's one of many social justice projects that enable its participants who face multiple discriminations to share their stories in an unquestioning way. The projects have been displayed at the United Nations in Geneva and New York in conjunction with the Human Rights Committee, Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. For over 20 years, Belinda has used art as a tool for advocacy to ensure the voices of those experiencing social inequality are remembered within the statistics. Please welcome to the stage Belinda Mason.
Thank you all for coming, and I would also like to recognise the valuable contribution of the North American First Nations women have given to the Silent Tears project. They are Leanne Kay, Nadima Argard, Mary Lyon, Silvana Rodriguez, Mona Stonefish and Michelle Mass. I pay respect to the strong First Nations women of Australia. Leela Rankin, Gower Rankin, Karen Leffers and Polly Sumner, women who walked beside me when I was a teenager and whose strength empowered me to stand here today. In contributing to the Silent Tears project, all of the women have intimately shared their stories of violence in an unquestioning way, and in doing so, they have made the personal political. 25 million people live in Australia. 1 in 6 women experience physical or sexual violence by a current or previous partner. Of those women, 67% acquire mental illness, such as anxiety or depression, and this can be temporary or lifelong. Compared with their peers, women with disabilities experience significantly higher levels of all forms of violence and are subjected to violence by a greater number of perpetrators. 90% of women with intellectual disabilities experience sexual or physical violence during their lives. Each week in Australia, 1 woman is murdered by her current or previous partner. Each day, physical violence hospitalises 8 more. These are shocking numbers. But this violence is epidemic, as it is hidden, and one can imagine a much bigger unreported cost. There are no statistics for the following survivors: women who have acquired physical disability, sensory or cognitive impairments as a result of that violence. Their experiences would reveal how much violence impacts individuals, families, and communities in the days and weeks, months and decades later, and would provide important information to improve and inform social policy. Violence against women and girls with disability is underreported and under-recognised. There's even less recognition that violence causes disability. Including all women with disabilities is a big, important and global conversation within gender-based violence and is essential to ensure that no woman is left behind. When examining intersectionality, it must be approached with an integrity to ensure that all disabilities are represented equally in research. The Silent Tears Project participants are women with disabilities who've been subjected to violence or women who've acquired disability caused by violence. From the G20, OECD and developing nations, these remarkable women represent 5 continents, 20 countries, including Australia, New Zealand, Samoa, Korea, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Guatemala, Mexico, Ecuador, the United States, Canada, West Africa, Mali, South Africa, Germany, Italy, Ireland, and the Netherlands. They courageously share different experiences of violence and provide a deeply moving testament to its impact in their lives and the lives of those around them. Domestic and cultural violence, forced sterilisation, female genital mutilation, psychological trauma, neglect, no access to justice or emergency services, healthcare or education, human trafficking, workplace violence, cyberbullying, child pornography, child sexual abuse, physical and sexual abuse within institutions or by family members. A list of horror, perpetrators of which are both men and, yes, women. For each of the women in the project, there are many thousands more whose stories and lives are invisible. There are women who share the same experiences and yet they're culturally different, providing recognition that they are not isolated in their experiences. Some women have chosen to share their story anonymously and feel safe in doing it in that way. Others reveal their identity, and for those who share their secret with me, but chose not to participate through fear of retribution, I hold the burden of their stories that may never be told. Without stories, there is silence. Without stories told, we are voiceless. Without our stories heard, we are invisible. It's even harder when the stories are hard to hear and impossible to imagine. Globally, disabled women and girls experience multiple discriminations impacting on their daily lives. They are more likely to be victims and survivors of violence. In rural areas, this is compounded by geographical and social isolation. Many of the women we met through Silent Tears came from small communities and travelled long distances to meet us. And for several women, it was the first time in months they'd ventured from their homes. Miju Kim, President of Women with Disabilities Australia Arts and Cultural Network in the Republic of Korea, shared with us the unique story driven by violence against women with disability that shocked the country and resulted in justice being served and government responding with sweeping changes. In a country whose population of 51.5 million, they have more than 20 call centres for women with disability who experience violence and more than 20 shelters for women with disability only. They provide specific long-term housing for women with disability who've been subjected to violence. Yet in Australia, there is no dedicated call centre for women with disability who experience violence, and until very recently, very little shelters could offer support for them. In most large Western cultures, we found that the red tape and high expectations hindered the ability to respond effectively, creating fatigue in support workers. We also saw that having service provision potentially can shift the responsibility of care away from the individual and family supports to an entity, which can dehumanise the process and exacerbate the problem. In non-Western communities where gender-based violence is only just emerging, powerful, inclusive grassroots cooperatives thrive against all odds and are forging change in their communities. We witnessed extraordinary women who work at the coalface and due to lack of financial support were unable to attend. The next presentations are just some short presentations from the women who were unable to attend.
Hello, I'm Ida Putri, currently work for Ohana Indonesia. I'm a woman with short stature due to accident when I was a kid. I would like to say sorry that I cannot meet you in person, but I have messages from my country. In the context of Indonesia, where patriarchy culture exists, women with disabilities are one of the most marginalized groups for being women and having disabilities. The National Commission on Women's Rights, or Komnas Perempuan, in 2017 mentioned that the cases of sexual violence against women with disabilities happen because of the assumption that women with disabilities has no sexual desire, or the stigma that women with disabilities, in particular women with intellectual disabilities, have higher sexual desire. Talking about women with disabilities in the rural area who are away from access and opportunity are even worsened. For developing countries like Indonesia, where the government is not fully aware of fulfillment on the rights of persons with disabilities, the role of community support is matter. By joining the organization established in their area, they are able to share knowledge, empowering, and even advocating the local government in disability issue.
In relation to girls with disabilities, there's very little exploration that has really happened. There are layers and layers of violence. There are huge concerns of safety and security. Many of our girls with disabilities are isolated at home. Is perhaps the worst violence we can do to a child. There is still a feeling within communities that the girl with disability cannot and perhaps cannot be educated, that she would not be. What is her future? These are the big questions that I think we are still asking, because there is a lack of information about what is possible. And I think that's the crux of the matter. There are many systems, violence can become less when all the systems in society get equipped to deal with diversity. For that, actually, you need to have a whole lot of personnel who are trained, which is where we are lacking at present. So those are some of the things we need to do in India.
I'm Rebecca Peters, I'm Australian, and I'm supporting Transitions as a volunteer organisation that deals with a lot of people who are victims and survivors of gun violence, because gun violence is the #1 cause of spinal cord injury in Guatemala. A bullet is designed specifically to destroy tissue and bone and nerves and organs. So it doesn't just make a hole in you and go through, and if you're unlucky, cut your spinal cord. The devastation that is wrought by these weapons is just far beyond the way that it's portrayed and the way that the public or that policymakers imagine. The vast majority of gun deaths and injury do not occur in war. They are victims of crime. They are victims of domestic violence. The women who were interviewed in Guatemala for the Silent Tears Project clearly illustrate that the typical gun violence survivor in Guatemala is not someone who has any connection with crime. And so, and they're normal people trying to get on with their lives in a context where the basic services that they need are not available.
June Oscar is a proud Aboriginal woman and is the Australian Human Rights Commission's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. Her journey to be in this role was triggered by the need she felt to make change with the support of her remote community of Fitzroy Crossing in Western Australia's Kimberley region. June is a strong advocate for Indigenous Australian languages, social justice, women's issues, and has worked tirelessly to reduce fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Her work intersects disability, alcohol and violence in remote communities and is a testament to the power of communities to drive change and empower other women to follow.
So now you have I think, a really good understanding of the universality of the theme for the Silent Tears project, and also the breadth and depth of the violence experienced by women with disability and the acquisition of disability through very, very many forms of violence. I'd like to introduce firstly our panellists who have an extraordinary amount of expertise. They are each panellist in their area of expertise identify the connections between violence and disability. They can either be the recognition that violence does happen to women and girls with a disability, or that violence can cause disability. Each panellist is going to, here's the talent, contextualise this with a case study or explanation of the complexity we're talking about, and hopefully reveal some solutions that we are all needing to look for and deliver on, so that we can improve our legislative, social and structural barriers for women and women living with disabilities. I'd like to introduce to you Bonnie Braden. Bonnie is a recognised leader in both the feminist and disability movements. She's been the National Executive Director of the Disabled Women's Network in Canada, known as DAWN, since 2007. In this role, she has proven herself as a formidable advocate, beware, for women with disabilities here in Canada and internationally. During her tenure with DAWN, Bonnie has worked diligently and to highlight key issues that impact the lives of women with disabilities, regards to health, equity, housing, employment and violence, to name a few. Bonnie's commitment to women with disabilities spreads further than her office. She's also the president of Kudabali? Kudabale. I have to get my French on. Clean Sweepers, an innovative social enterprise which provides home care services to people with disabilities and seniors in their Montreal community. Welcome, Bonnie. Bonnie's also a participant in Silent Tears.
Bonjour, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm on page 18, and I want to thank Belinda, Silent Tears, everybody, Denise, Julie, our guests, for joining us today. Okay, I've got too many slides, and we want to talk and spend some time, so I'm going to go through some of them quite quickly and focus on the ones where I think the content is. Again, this presentation will be available after, so like I said, for any of these slides I skipped through, this is just a bit about DAWN Canada and our mission and our 33 years in service. So I think the most important thing to focus on in terms of, from a DAWN perspective, is how we do our work. We do our work through 4 pillars: research, education, policy, and advocacy. And I think the conversation we're having today is very much about those things and about an evidence-based approach and the fact that we need a great deal more research. Some great researchers in the room. I want to acknowledge Rena Arsenault, who's here, whose work I'm going to be sharing today also, and Jane Stinson. I'm sure there's others. In terms of Canadian context, it's, again, these slides I'll skip through quickly, but it was, again, around setting the context for women with disabilities in a Canadian context and indeed in a rural context, so that we understand that in Canadian and in any context that it is rural women, northern women, women who are in remote regions, regardless of where they are in the world, that are always the most vulnerable and the least likely to be served. Again, in terms of some of the important research that I'd like to point to, Dr. Angela Colantonio has been doing important work, University of Toronto, and again, all of this stuff will be available after, with respect to understanding where we are locating women with disabilities in a Canadian context. So the overrepresentation of women with disabilities, Indigenous women and racialized women, is really quite striking. And again, if you look at this piece of information, 40% of women prisoners in Ontario had one thing in common, two things in common: a physical or emotional abuse and a pre-existing brain injury. Speaking to, again, what Belinda was referring to earlier. Because this is an earlier slide. Okay, so again, this is from the same researcher, Angela Colantonio, again focused on the fact that what we are doing is actually criminalizing women with disabilities. Another study that Angela did was focused on the homeless population in Toronto and revealed that more than half of the women that are homeless in Toronto had one thing in common, which was a pre-existing brain injury before they became homeless. So again, I think again in terms of talking about who we're talking about women who may not wear a label or understand they have a disability, but who are indeed women with disabilities. So again, another research report that's worth sharing, and a story that's important to share around the issue of women with mental health disabilities, is Ashley Smith. And Ashley Smith's story, which is one of the ones featured in this report, Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading, died in prison. And her crime was she threw an apple at a postal worker, and she's dead. Ashley had a mild intellectual disability and ended up in prison before she was 18. And before she died, I think she had been moved 28 times. She had been held in solitary confinement. She begged for help, and the guards watched her die. Women with disabilities, sex work, and I would say also more significantly, human trafficking. And again, these are two studies. There's very limited research, I should say, but there was a qualitative study in Canada in 2014 with 3,500 sex workers. And one of the things that was really important that came through in the research, but that the researchers failed to note, was that 35% of those women identified as having a long-term disability before they became sex workers. So again, that's more than a third of sex workers in the Canadian context, and I'm quite sure that if we transferred that to any country, it would be applicable. And so for people to understand, again, homeless, prisons, and sex and human trafficking. I had the privilege of a leader visitor program here in the United States in Washington, D.C. last year with some colleagues from Canada, where we began to touch at the very surface of something that I think is really important for people to understand, which is that when you're talking about human trafficking, you are talking about women and people with disabilities. And all I can say about that is some people have a disability when they are trafficked, but anybody who's been trafficked ends up with PTSD and some form of disability. So let's be really clear, the disability lens has to be added to any form of violence we're talking about, because in every case, if you add that lens, you begin to understand systemic issues and systemic gaps. Rural women are also at risk of physical violence and abuse, isolation, patriarchal attitudes that objectivity and devalue women, objectify and devalue women, and the presence of a gun culture where owning and using weapons are condoned and where access to weapons is enhanced, contribute to violence in the lives of rural women. And of course, we've already heard about the fact that gun violence leads to disability, so it's important to make that connection when you're talking about women and gun violence. Research shows that urban women with physical disabilities have a high prevalence of depression. Rural women's rate of depression is twice that of other women, and rural women with disabilities face additional risks and unique barriers such as poorer health, less education, and greater dependence on government programs than their urban counterparts. So I think the other thing, that's my president, Carmela Hutchison, there in participating in a really wonderful project I'll share the resources for later, called FemNorthNet. And again, in the context of rural women and depression, I'd like everybody to think also about something that has become, and I know this is controversial, but medical assistance in dying is legislated in Canada. And to be really clear, while I'm not judging medical assistance in dying, it's important for people to understand that women with disabilities are much more vulnerable to being coerced in a situation like that. And it's a very important discussion that needs to be part of the larger discussions around violence against women. And to be really clear that one of the things we need to do is to focus some of the resources in terms of suicide prevention, palliative care, and end-of-life care very specifically for women with disabilities. Given that higher suicide rates have been found in the rural than in urban, the findings that nearly 20% of women were having suicidal thoughts is alarming. At risk for severe depression were women who were younger, those with more pain, more limited mobility, and/or less satisfaction with their social networks. Women with disabilities in Canada have the highest rates of unemployment, the highest rates of poverty, and the highest rates of violence of any cohort. If you add the intersection of race, indigeneity, rural, any of those things, you begin to look at the women who are the very worst off in a Canadian context. Peer support and community empowerment. So peer support is critical to women in terms of surviving violence. And peer support, and again, I'm giving a Canadian context for these purposes, doesn't exist for women with disabilities in Canada. There are no peer support groups, and women with disabilities are not at the table. They're not there when the resource discussions are happening. We're going to be talking about policy and how policy happens, and policy happens, and it captures you when you're there to talk, when you're there to speak for yourself. And this absence of peer support groups for women with disabilities in Canada and everywhere is a really important way that the larger women's movement really needs to understand and engage. And that peer support doesn't mean helping women with disabilities start their own groups. It's inviting them into your community, into your work, onto your boards, into your staff. Barriers in the environment. Rural areas often lack environmental features required by non-drivers with disabilities, such as sidewalks, curb cuts, and street crossings with accessible traffic signals. Therefore, even if rural residents live close enough to walk or roll in a wheelchair to their healthcare facility, getting there safely may prove difficult. Now, can we imagine that in a northern context? I'm from the near north, and I can tell you that the reality of being perhaps in a wheelchair, for example, where I'm from, would mean that you were housebound all the time, no access. Don't even get started on transportation, because we know, and I won't repeat what we know, which is that whether a woman has a disability, whatever her situation might be, if she's in a rural setting, she's vulnerable because she doesn't have access to transportation. And there are things that need to be developed and can be developed around ride sharing. There's a whole bunch of things that can be done. We just need to start putting our hands to the wheel. This is a wonderful tool that was developed through the FemNorthNet project. It's going to be on the resource list that we leave for all of you. At the end of my presentation, I'll show you our website. And again, this is a free tool. You can have it in French or in English. It's a really important tool for how you convene inclusively, how you begin to include women and girls with disabilities in those conversations at those policy tables. So this quote is from a very dear friend of mine, Neil Belanger, who runs the only organization in Canada for Indigenous people with disabilities. I'm honored to be working with Neil. And again, this is something Neil tells us, and I say it for him. Indigenous women living with a disability face barriers and discrimination, actions on 3 fronts: being a woman, being Indigenous, and living with a disability. So yes, we're talking about from an intersectional perspective. We have to do all the work from an intersectional perspective, starting from one place, but from all. Ana! Hola! Bienvenida! Gracias. Indigenous women in rural areas. And again, I again acknowledge Rena Arsenault, whose work is cited here. This is again something that will be available after the presentation today. And I feel because of time, it's not a good idea for me to read these things to you, but if you start to look at what we're talking about here in terms of intimate partner violence, and then you add the disability lens, you begin to understand. And I will say something else for anybody who's in Canada. You must demand that the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry add the disability lens to their work. They haven't, and they need to understand that these women, many of these women, had a disability but didn't wear a label is so critical to understanding the systemic issues that bring us to a place where thousands of Indigenous women and girls are going missing in our country and in countries around the world. That is my former board member, Judy Johnny, who's since passed. More than 70% of the 53 Inuit communities spread across 4 geographic regions of the Canadian Arctic do not have a safe shelter for women and children experiencing family violence. Paktutut is a wonderful organization for Inuit women in Canada. And again, they have no data on women with disabilities, but just with this information alone, you can imagine what that means. One more minute? Are you kidding? Oh my gosh. Okay. So I'm going to fast forward to talking about the project that I think really helps us frame this, which is a project Dawn Canada has been doing called Legislation, Policy, and Service Responses to Violence Against Women with Disabilities. Sorry. So in terms of the research outcomes, and again, all of you got your more than a footnote flyer. If you didn't, please come up and get one, which is that in terms of what we've understood is that we've been ungendered in policy. And I was going to say in every document we reviewed, women with disabilities were called people with disabilities, lists of women, and then people with disabilities. So it's really important to understand that one of the things you need to do whenever you're talking about violence against women is to include women with disabilities. Name us. Name women with disabilities. Name deaf women. Make sure that you don't just name us, bring us to the table. So create culturally sensitive and specific services for Indigenous women across the lifespan. Create policies that understand life transitions are especially challenging for women and girls with disabilities. Access to employment and economic security. Funding for attendant care services in transition houses and shelters, safe, accessible, and reliable transportation in rural and remote communities. Training available in their communities, available for frontline workers in the RCMP in Canada, mental health first aid, on common issues such as PTSD, and on emerging issues such as brain injury. So very quickly, again, this is, again, from Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women. And it is an intersectional, an example of intersectionality, auditing regulatory bodies. So again, in the context wherever you are, wherever you're doing your work, one of the most important things we have to do is apply the disability lens, a violence against women lens, and of course, an intersectional lens. Canada is failing women and girls with disabilities. So Dawn Canada, I know I'm running over a tiny bit, but it's a broken clicker, it's not my fault. These are 3 examples of Dawn Canada's work in terms of civil society reporting and how important that becomes in your country, wherever you're from. So again, we've filed complaints under the Covenant, civil society shadow reports under the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, on the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and on the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And in every case over the last 2 years, what we've been able to demonstrate to the Government of Canada is they are actually failing women and girls with disabilities, and it's time for them to step up and begin to address this, because every law in Canada prohibits violence against women, all women, but despite the fact that the laws prohibit this, the single biggest issue we have in terms of crime is sexual violence and violence against women. With really sadly, like I said, one of the other statistics in Canada is only 5% of women come forward and report, and the conviction rates are at the same very low, depressing levels. So more than a footnote, again, is the campaign and platform Dawn has created to really begin this conversation, first and foremost, about the issues of violence against women with disabilities and deaf women in a Canadian and international context. But again, that references to the gap in policy. Women and girls with disabilities need to be more than a footnote in policy. We need to be central. If you really want to address violence against women, you have to start from those margins where we are and bring it in. And that's the only way things are going to change. So everybody take action. Everybody remember that it's up to everyone to take a stand and become part of our campaign. More than a footnote. The hashtag is up there. We'll be tweeting and talking about it today. Everybody spread the word. More than a footnote is one of the ways you can support women and girls with disabilities around the world and in Canada. Thank you to the Canadian Labour Congress. And last but not least, if you look up there, resources for participants, so Dawn Canada is leaving you a goodie basket on our website where you can pick up the presentation and some other resources, including the Inclusive Meeting Toolkit and other things that I referred to in my presentation. Thank you. Yeah, the one that they just saw up on the screen is the one that they've got in their book. Yeah. And yeah, like I said, I'm number 18.
Our next speaker is joining us from Oxfam International. As we've seen with Belinda's presentation, the women represented in Silent Tears are very much from around the world. Nkungu Magiro is the Gender and Women's Rights Advisor at Oxfam International Pan-Africa program. She has 10 years experience working in human rights programming and implementation, monitoring and advocacy focusing on the rights of women and men. She's an ardent advocate for women's rights and women's human rights and has successfully implemented programs in Africa in areas of sexual reproductive health, gender-based violence, HIV and AIDS, violence against women and girls and service delivery, women's leadership, democracy and governance, food security and livelihoods, women's economic empowerment and amongst other key projects. We welcome Nkungu to the stage. Thank you.
When it comes to Africa, accessing rights for women with disabilities in Africa is really a double challenge, mainly because of their gender. Within Oxfam International, the Pan-Africa program, for the last 10 years, we've been working around women's rights work across the continent, and mainly focusing on our continental frameworks and normative standards. As some of you may know, the work that women's rights organizations did in terms of pushing for an instrument that speaks to the African woman, that speaks to the African context. That is the protocol of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the rights of women in Africa. So within Africa, we see this as a key instrument for us, mainly because it looks at various issues, from elimination of discrimination against women, from the right to dignity, from elimination of harmful practices. And when we're talking of women with disabilities, we continuously see traditional harmful practices at play. For example, the issue of virgin cleansing, where within our societies, we still believe that to deal with issues of HIV and AIDS, for example, one can get treatment when you have sex with someone who is a virgin. And the first target is usually women with disabilities and girls. It also speaks to special protection of women with disabilities. And that becomes very important for us because laws and policies is one of the entry points when it comes to challenging even the attitudes and perceptions of women with disabilities within our continent. But we believe that the primary agency or the agency that is going to bring change within Africa really lies with women's rights organizations and targeting our own institutions like the African Union. And we felt the need of reinforcing this protocol and a lot of advocacy that went into play. And now we have the member states of African Union adopting the protocol on persons with disability rights. This has stemmed from the United Nations Convention of Persons with Disabilities, but really looked into the African context, the issues of extreme poverty, the rising cases of sexual abuse targeted at people and women with albinism and other forms of disabilities. So it tries to unpack that. But with our work, we say we cannot do it alone as Oxfam. And we've really been doing a lot of work in terms of building coalitions. And one of the coalitions that I'm proud to speak about is the Solidarity for African Women's Rights Coalition that really pushed for the ratification of this protocol. And it is a coalition not just of women's rights organizations, but of importance as organizations that work with women with disabilities and individuals with women with disabilities also are the forefront of advocacy. We talk of disability, in terms of long-term physical disability, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment. And the thing is, within our context, there's the disability that you can see, but they are the invisible ones. And we're seeing increasingly, for example, cases of autism, diagnosis of autism within the African continent. I am a mother of a son who is 5 years old, and I belong to a group called Kenya Autism Alliance, which is a support group for parents, mostly women, who share information, share experiences, guide each other, and support each other. And one of the issues that we discuss in that forum is issues of sexual abuse targeted at mostly at girls and even boys who are nonverbal. We had a case of a woman who shared a story of a neighbor. And she came to learn that her child, her girl, was constantly being abused by the father. And the only thing that she could do is to run away from home and move into the rural areas. She used to be in Nairobi. She did not report the matter because there's the reliance of the father to provide the financial support. But the challenge that she experiences in the rural areas is access to services, the therapies, the cost, the distance. It's not that it's better even in urban areas like Nairobi. It's just that it's even more challenging when you move outside environments like Nairobi. There's the issue of, again, if you look at another example, within the SOA coalition, we normally have articles. It's called Pambazuka, which is a Swahili word that loosely translates into sunrise. So we talk of stories and how we use stories to push for legislation, to push for justice. One of the stories that was once shared was for a girl who is deaf. Under the care of a neighbor, sexually abused every day. One day the mother came back home earlier and she discovered that the girl was shaking and her clothes were soiled, and immediately knew what had happened. She didn't go to the hospital. For her, the first instinct was to report the matter to the police. And this is what she encountered. One, the police said she could not record the statement of the girl because they had no interpretation services. And he could not rely on what the mother was saying because, they don't want to believe the story. She didn't get justice just because of lack of services. But it really shows the importance of our awareness on the plight and the situation of women with disabilities, the need to target law enforcement, the police, the judiciary, so that access to justice becomes a reality. But you also look at violence and how it has caused disabilities. And again, I'll share a case of Coast Region, that is in Mombasa, in Kenya, where a woman was pushed by the spouse onto an oncoming train and she lost her limbs. But what I have to say about this story is how I saw the women within a coalition in Kenya. It's called Sauti ya Wanawake. Again, a Swahili word that loosely translates to women's voices. A coalition that has women with disabilities also at the forefront. And we saw them taking charge and pursuing this case. First and foremost, getting the health services. Secondly, pursuing justice. We have to see where that goes. But the challenge within our society is perception of persons with disability. Always in isolation, always excluded. We talk of general population, but we have to talk of simply population, because women with disabilities are part of the population and should not be seen in isolation. And Bonnie has, I think, spoken so much about it, how women with disabilities are susceptible to violence, which is really ingrained at a personal level, that we have to really question our value systems as individuals. So, addressing the issue, we need to go beyond legislation. Legislations are good because they reinforce our behavior. They help in changing an attitude. They're still key. But we have to combine several approaches. When you look at the issue of access to services, and I can give an example of education. When you look at our government budgets, sectors like education and health are really never their priority. And when you come to even an example of health and primary health care, the budget allocated to sexual reproductive health and rights is very minimal. And if it's minimal, and we're talking about isolation and exclusion, then you can imagine women with disabilities are always at the periphery in access to these resources. We talk of comprehensive sexual reproductive health education, and we are seeing governments taking this up and including it in the curriculum. But the question that we keep on asking is, what is comprehensive sexual education? Is it packaged in a manner that is able to reach people with intellectual disabilities, with sensory disabilities, people who cannot hear, the deaf, the blind? So it is good to sound on paper it's comprehensive sexual reproductive health, but is it reaching the women's population? And where are the women with disabilities? We talk of advocating for resource allocation and gender-responsive budgeting. But again, we always fall into the trap of looking at women as a homogeneous group. Even in the discussion, in the discourse, in the policy and budget negotiations, we really need to see women with disabilities present, and we have to support and facilitate. But they cannot do it alone. So that is why we see the importance of multi-agency, that within the women's rights movement, it's good that we're having this kind of discussion, but this struggle cannot be left alone to women with disabilities. We have to move together as a women's rights movement to champion ending violence against women and girls, and that will, and especially for women with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've got two more speakers, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions for the sort of the closing 5-7 minutes. Anna has just joined us. Thank you. She's Executive Vice President of the European Disability Forum, and we're really grateful that she could join us. As you know, getting around New York at the moment is a little bit difficult. She was elected to this post in 2015 and is Executive Vice President of the CERMI Women's Foundation, Executive Counsellor for International Relations and External Development at the Spanish National Organisation of the Blind, once. Anna is a former member of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities, where she was the focal point on gender issues and co-chaired the working group in charge of drafting its general comment on women with disabilities, Article 6. She's an expert on gender issues in the Council of the Spanish Royal Board of Disability and the Women's Health Observatory of the Ministry of Health in Consumer Affairs. Anna, we're really grateful that you could join us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express my apologies to not be able to join you from the beginning of this side event, very important. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to contribute in this panel for the situation in relation with women and girls with disabilities, linking with violence and the rural situation, which is really fundamental. It's my great honor to be with you today. Following the information provided by UN Women, every 5 women, one has a disability. If we look at the population of people with disabilities, every 5 persons with disabilities, 3 are women. That means a huge population in the world, more than 600 million of women and girls has a disabilities in the world today. Unfortunately, I must say, after my work in the UNCRPD committee, that most of the state parties don't have any kind of consideration of gender in the policies linking with disabilities. And that has a very real meaning today, this year, in 2018, when we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the entry into force of the CRPD Convention. The CRPD Convention has a very important article, Article 6, on women and girls with disabilities. An article divides in two very important paragraphs. The first one, recognizing that we, women and girls with disabilities, suffer multiple forms of discrimination. It's clear. It's expressed by the UNCRPD Convention. The second paragraph, also important, the need to ensure the full development, empowerment, and advance of women and girls with disability by the state parties, with all the appropriate measures to do that. This year, after 10 years of the entry into force of the UNCRPD Convention, we must say that Article 6 is not implemented by the global community. Article 6 still behind, still in the agenda, because in fact, there are no measures to ensure the full implementation of this article. We must say that unfortunately, if we look at the situation globally in relation with women issues or gender equality policies, the consideration of women and girls with disabilities is missing. Why? Because we, these 600 million of citizens in the world, we are not women. For the society, we are not women. We are just disabled. This is how society considers us. This is how society think about us. And this is why we are not part of any kind of policy in relation with us. This is why the disability policies don't take into consideration our own situations. This is why the global policies on women issues don't take into consideration the fact of disabilities. It was mentioned by Bonnie. If we are not named, we don't exist. And this is what is happening now, right now. If we look at the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, especially SDG 5, gender equality, they are not mentioned at all in relation with the fact of disabilities in the feminine population. Who is behind? To leave no one behind is the motto for the SDGs. Who is behind and why? Just women and girls with disabilities. This population is really forgotten, invisible, without any consideration. Why? First of all, because we don't have sexual identity in front of the society, in front of the United Nations even. And due to this non-sexual identity, we are not considered as women. There is also a very critical link to our reproductive rights. Because we are not women, society don't consider us able to become mothers and to have the chance to look after our children. So we are denied also in relation with the full enjoyment of our reproductive rights. But that happened not like that. That happened very often with a previous action against, once again, to us, which is the legal capacity. Very often, before to have a forced sterilization of forced abortions, which happen very often in many places, in many states, in many countries in the world. Before this decision, it was taking another decision to withdraw the legal capacity of this woman. And to withdraw the legal capacity just because a decision about forced abortion or forced sterilization means in this case that is a real mutilation about all of our civil, economical, and political rights. Many women with disabilities don't have a legal capacity. And that means that they cannot access to justice. They are more vulnerable to suffer, for example, violence and sexual abuse because the people around, the family, the relatives knows that there are no consequences, physical consequences, pregnancies after a sexual abuse, for example. And this situation is even worse for women and girls with intellectual disabilities, psychosocial disabilities, deaf blindness, for example, which means also that in the global family of women and girls with disabilities, we need to pay attention to this human diversity also inside of our population. What we need to do, how we can overcome the situation of real exclusion and real vulneration about all of our fundamental rights and freedom. I think it's time to adopt a twin-track approach in this regard. And now we have the opportunity this year. It's also a key year to change the way that women with disabilities are considered here in the United Nations system, here where we are talking about human rights for all. If you look at the composition of the CRPD committee, you can see very clearly that is not fair. Because for 18 seats, 17 are taken by men and just one for a woman. That shows you exactly how is the situation. The real exclusion of women with disabilities in the global policies on disabilities. And this is why now, more than ever, we need to influence state parties of the CRPD to support the inclusion, the elections of women with disabilities, especially women with disabilities. They are wonderful women coming from all regions, with disabilities especially. And I ask you kindly to contact your state parties to support these people, these women with disabilities. They are more than ready to contribute, to ensure that in any work of the CRPD committee, the gender perspectives are going to be considered. But we have also a chance to have this twin-track approach and to take the issue of disabilities in the committee where work to eliminate any form of discrimination against women, where we are not present. Women with disabilities being a fifth of the feminine population never had the chance to be part of the CEDAW committee. This year, I am running for this position for a second time. I tried to open the door to the disabilities perspective in the CEDAW committee 1.5 years. I fell for one vote because a state party once again don't see us as women. And we need really to change the way, because it's just having this twin-track approach how we can really implement the full and the fundamental rights for all of us, women and girls with disabilities. So this is why it's so important also to support, to establish, to support the work of the number, in this moment very little, of organization of women with disabilities in the world. We need to have the voices of women with disabilities everywhere, in every state parties, at the regional level, in relation with the different type of disabilities. We need to have the right for political participation, which is forgotten. Just having the voices of women and girls with disabilities, we can be sure that our fundamental rights can be a reality for all of us. Think about us and support us. Thank you.
Denise is actually one of the artists for Silent Tears, but she's also an honours graduate of social work from Western Sydney University. She's currently doing a PhD exploring sexual education provision of women with physical disability and their experience of violence. She's 16 years as a disability advocate in Australia and around the world. Can we welcome Denise?
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the women that have gone before me and spoken today, and also the women that go before me in the disability rights movement. Within an Australian context, the debates that have been highlighted today globally are reflected in an Australian context. Women with disabilities, and particularly women in rural areas, and women who identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and women who have multiple impairments experience multiple discriminations. When I'm looking at sexual education provision to women with physical disability, there is a lot of literature that exists around sexual education provision and sexuality of women with intellectual disability, but it's written from a protectionist perspective. And there is a policy shift in Australia that's happening at the moment called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It is a protection mechanism for people who were born with a disability to have support available to them in their homes. It's supposed to be all of life, across life perspective, and it's supposed to be available to everybody. But what is being found in rural areas, because there are minimal services there in the first place, people are having difficulty to obtain supports and to make those supports because there are few options or no supports available. And when you are provided support from the NDIS, you also have to pay for transport cost. Now imagine living in a rural, remote area, and Australia is a large place. It took us 21 hours to get here. So it's large. There are some rural towns that you can travel hours to and not actually see another human being. But if all your money is taken by travel costs and associated support costs for the worker, how much legitimate support do you receive? And how culturally appropriate and sensitive is it? Because you may only want people that reflect yourselves. So intersectionality, which has been highlighted today, is an important approach because women and girls with disability are often just seen as their disability, and that's become apparent to me through my research, in that women with disability are desexualized or asexualized. So therefore, if we can't claim our identity of our womanhood, of part of our pride, how can we actually stand up and count when people don't see us as women, as potential contributors. People with disability are seen as passive, and we should be grateful, but really we are contributors. And things like the NDIS are reflective of that as potential because they employ people to help people with disability. So people with disability and women with disability are potential employers. So we have power in that. And women need to be involved in decision-making processes to create change. Because what I've learnt with travelling with the projects, with Silent Tears particularly into remote areas like Indonesia and South Africa, is that if you work from a community-based level, that's when the change stays. So that's why it's important that civil society actually is involved in it, because civil society actually equates to being inclusive and recognising everybody. Does anyone have any questions for me or anyone of the panel today?
Thank you, and thank you for bringing it up. I can tell you that, there's a member of my board who's in her 40s who was forced into a seniors residence in Prince Edward Island because there's no accessible housing for her in Charlottetown. So she's now forced to live in rural Prince Edward Island. And again, that's the absence of supports for people with disabilities and women with disabilities in particular. Our focus, of course, to live independently. And again, Denise makes the point, right? If we start to think of how we do inclusive living for all people in Canada, there's implications around what that means for housing, what it means for the recognition of the need for secure personal care, and that the idea of having training and standards is quite important. We have federal accessibility legislation coming forward in Canada in 2018, and I think it's really important that when we look at that we begin to look very carefully at what that means in terms of enforcement. And, it's not my desire to end up in a monitoring situation in Canada, but I can tell you that's certainly one of the things that Dawn Canada feels, needs to be a role, because, what we hear over and over again is that there's an acknowledgement, it's mentioned, it's understood, but that doesn't get moved forward in a policy context. Thinking particularly of, your brother's situation again, because there is no standard, there's fear. And, Canada's a big country with provinces and territories, and of course one of the biggest issues we have is jurisdictional. I'm working currently with a federal government that's much friendlier than the previous federal government, not saying they're my best friends, they're not my besties, but like I said, there's been some improvements. But when I start to talk about where, service delivery happens, it happens from provincial, territorial, and municipal governments. That's where those things occurs. So, we need to get away from this sort of top-down to a more horizontal approach to how we address the social and economic issues of all women in the country. And I think that, that's one of the fundamental issues we have, is that we don't have that kind of horizontal approach. We do top-down, and we're very ineffective. And so policies keep coming forward, but they're not implemented properly. So, having a better relationship between the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments for me is a very basic one. Gillian Kilfoyle is here from Prince Edward Island, and at the Bold Vision Conference, this is one of the things I remembered we focused on really strongly, was how important it is to understand that that's the way you have to have an approach. Talk about rural Canada, and you're talking about where, again, it's got nothing to do with what's happening at the federal level, it's got everything to do with what's happening in your backyard and in your community. So thanks for bringing that forward, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Sorry, with respect to the CSW program, we're actually going to need to move it on. I'm watching the organisers at the back kind of blink at me. Sorry? Oh, okay. Can I take one more question? And then what we'll do is that you can come up and ask the speakers while the next event moves in. So at the back?
I'm Rama from Nepal, sorry. I'm Rama from Nepal, and I'm also a woman with disability. So I have been working 20 years in the disability field for women with disability. So can you share something about the mainstreaming our issues with other organizations, I mean women's organization, because we have our policies, we have our laws and everything, but it's very hard to do the advocacy, or it's very hard to mainstreaming our issues with others women's groups, because they said that women's means all, So, but our needs are totally different. So that's why, do you have any experience that joining hands with other mainstreaming organization? Thank you.
I've had experience in working with mainstream organisations back in Australia, and the thing is that needs to happen is they say it's a disability issue, it's a specialist issue. When you mention the word disability, people need to realise that people with disability are the largest proportion of the population, and then women make up the largest proportion of that. So we're not a small minority. So people need to respond to us, and they actually need to see us as not specialists. We're citizens. We have a right to see services, and this specialisation, it has a place if you want it, but you should have a choice, because the NDIS is reflective of that. Someone can go to a community centre and access a service, and they have to be willing to provide that service. So it's this specialisation that prevents going forward, because women with disability, people with disability, if they talk amongst themselves only, then nothing changes and it doesn't stick. So being reflective of the audience today is a good start, and saying that we're women, that we have other identities is really, really important to bring about change.
Thank you, Denise.
I just want to also add to that again, when we talked before about the approach, I know that it's challenging to get the research, but it's research and educating women's organizations and larger social justice movements. If you have unions in your country, I encourage you to go to the unions, because they often have policies, whether they always apply them or not, that are very focused on the rights of individuals with disabilities, on women, and so on. So there's different mechanisms, but like I said, research, education, policy reform, and advocacy, and calling on everyone to work with us in that context. Because women with disabilities are what? More than a footnote.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Really, really thank the speakers and the panellists. Sorry that Anna couldn't stay. She's got a ridiculous schedule today. As you can see, she's a bit fired up as well. If you want to ask the panellists questions just while we're packing up, please do so. Thank you so much for coming. We really do appreciate it. The Silent Tears exhibition will be travelling around the world and is in New York at the moment. We'll be staying in New York until halfway through May. So if you're a local, then please seek it out. Thank you very much.